Sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is follow his heart when his mind tells him to walk away. In that single moment when we choose compassion over caution, we often discover that mercy comes with a price we never expected to pay. Haldrik the Stoneborn learned this lesson the hard way when he pulled a terrified girl from a burning building 3 days ago. He's a giant of a man, 7 feet tall with 30 years of battle scars, but when he saw her bruised face and frightened eyes, something stirred in his warrior's heart. She won't tell him her name or where she came from. She just clings to him like he's the only safe thing left in her world. For 3 quiet days, he sheltered her in his remote homestead, asking no questions and expecting no trouble. Then the elite shield maidens arrive, with polished weapons and deadly intent. The girl he saved isn't a runaway thrall. She's the missing daughter of his clan's greatest enemy, and her rescue has just lit the fuse on a blood feud that could destroy everything. But when they demand her surrender, and he sees pure terror return to her eyes, what choice will his heart make? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, wrapping Haldrik's homestead in a shroud of silver and silence. From his wooden porch, he could see the dark waters stretching toward distant mountains, their peaks crowned with snow that never melted, not even in the height of summer. This place had been his sanctuary for 5 years now, ever since he'd hung up his sword and chosen the quiet life of a landowner over the glory and gore of the raiding seasons. Haldrik the Stoneborn, a name earned not through birth but through the way he could stand unmoved in battle, while lesser men fell around him like wheat before the scythe. At 47 winters, he carried himself with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned that true strength came not from the speed of your blade, but from knowing when to draw it and when to keep it sheathed. His hands, broad as dinner plates and scarred from countless campaigns, were gentle now as they worked the land that had become his peace. The homestead itself reflected the man who built it, solid, unpretentious, and built to last. The main hall was constructed from thick pine logs, each one hand-selected and fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. The roof was covered in sod that had grown thick with wildflowers, making the entire structure appear as if it had grown from the earth itself rather than been imposed upon it. Inside, the walls were lined with practical furnishings, a long oak table scarred by years of use, chairs carved from driftwood, and shelves holding the simple necessities of a man who had learned to value substance over ornament. But it was the girl who had transformed this bachelor's retreat into something approaching a home. She sat now at the kitchen table, wrapped in Haldrik's battle-worn cloak, a massive bear fur garment that had seen him through more winters than he cared to count. The cloak dwarfed her small frame, making her appear even younger than her 16 or 17 summers suggested. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and when she turned toward the morning light, Haldrik could see the fading bruises on her left cheek, purple and yellow reminders of whatever violence had driven her to that burning outpost 3 days ago. She hadn't spoken a single word since he'd carried her from the flames. Not when he'd tended to her wounds with the rough but gentle hands of a man who had patched up more battlefield injuries than any healer. Not when old Astrid, his housekeeper, had clucked over her like a mother hen and insisted on preparing special broths to build up her strength. Not even when the nightmares came in the dark hours before dawn, and she would wake gasping and reaching for something or someone that wasn't there. But her eyes spoke volumes. They were the color of winter seas, gray-green and deep with secrets that seemed too heavy for such a young soul to carry. When she looked at him, Haldrik saw gratitude mixed with something that troubled him deeply, a kind of desperate hope, as if she believed he might be the answer to prayers she couldn't voice. "She's been watching the horizon again," old Astrid murmured as she ladled porridge into wooden bowls. The housekeeper was a woman of 60 winters, with silver hair braided down her back and hands that never seemed to stop working. She had served Haldrik's household since he'd first established the homestead, and he valued her counsel almost as much as her cooking. Every morning, same as yesterday and the day before, like she's expecting someone. Haldrik glanced toward the girl, who had indeed turned her attention to the eastern path that wound down from the high country. Her fingers worked nervously at something beneath the cloak. He had noticed her doing this before, a repetitive gesture that seemed to comfort her, perhaps. "She's watching for whoever hurt her to come back," he said quietly. "Or perhaps she's watching for whoever should have protected her in the first place." Astrid replied with the bluntness that had made her both invaluable and occasionally infuriating as a companion. The old woman set a bowl of porridge before the girl, along with honey and dried berries, luxuries that Haldrik would not normally indulge in, but which he had insisted upon since bringing his unexpected guest home. The girl nodded her thanks, a gesture so graceful and formal that it spoke of noble upbringing, and then began to eat with the careful, measured bites of someone who had recently known real hunger. "She has good manners," Astrid observed, settling into her own chair with the slow deliberation of someone whose joints had earned their protests through decades of hard work. "Noble manners, if you ask me. Look at how she holds her spoon, how she keeps her back straight even when she thinks no one is watching. This is no thrall's daughter, Haldrik." The observation had occurred to him as well, though he had tried to dismiss it. Noble-born children rarely found themselves alone and friendless in burning buildings. But there were other signs that supported Astrid's assessment: the softness of the girl's hands, unmarked by the calluses that came from a lifetime of manual labor. The way she instinctively deferred to him, while maintaining an underlying dignity that suggested she was accustomed to respect. And most tellingly, the carved raven pendant that hung from a silver chain around her neck. He had noticed the pendant on the first night when he had helped Astrid change the girl into clean clothes. It was a beautiful piece of work, carved from black stone and inlaid with silver wire in intricate patterns that spoke of master craftsmanship. The raven was depicted with wings spread, and its eyes were tiny garnets that caught the firelight. It was the kind of heirloom that passed from mother to daughter in the great houses, valuable not just for its materials, but for the lineage it represented. Yet the girl guarded it as if it were made of poison rather than precious stone. Whenever anyone's gaze lingered on it, she would pull the cloak tighter around her throat, hiding the pendant from view. When she bathed, always alone, always with the door barred, she would clutch it so tightly that Astrid swore she could hear the chain straining. "Whatever family she comes from," Haldrik said carefully, "they've failed her badly. No child should carry the kind of fear I see in her eyes." "Fear, yes," Astrid agreed. "But there's something else there too. Something that worries me more." "What do you mean?" The old woman leaned forward, lowering her voice, though the girl showed no sign of understanding their conversation. "She's not just afraid of what's behind her, Haldrik. She's afraid of what's ahead. Yesterday, when I was mending that tear in her dress, I caught her looking at you with such desperate hope that it broke my heart. She's not just grateful for the rescue, she's counting on you for something more. Something bigger than shelter and safety." Before Haldrik could respond, the girl suddenly went rigid in her chair. Her spoon clattered to the table as she turned toward the eastern path, her entire body tense with alertness. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the rocky shore below the homestead. Then Haldrik heard it too, the rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth. Still distant but approaching fast. He rose from his chair with the fluid motion of a man whose reflexes had been honed by 3 decades of warfare. His hand automatically moving toward where his sword would hang if he still wore it constantly. The girl's eyes found his, and in them he saw naked terror. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't catch, and her hand went to the pendant at her throat. Whatever she had been dreading, whatever she had been watching for each morning on the horizon, it was finally coming. "Astrid," he said quietly, "take her to the back room and stay with her." But the girl shook her head violently, clinging to his arm with surprising strength. She pointed toward the approaching riders, then to herself. then made a slashing motion across her throat. The meaning was unmistakable. If he let them take her, she believed she would die. The hoofbeats grew louder, more distinct. Multiple horses riding hard and with purpose. Not the casual pace of traders or the measured progress of travelers, but the focused urgency of a war, party with a specific destination in mind. Haldrik looked down at the girl, this mysterious child who had stumbled into his peaceful life and brought with her the kind of trouble he had tried to leave behind. He thought of the simple choice he had made 3 days ago, pulling her from those flames without question or hesitation. How could such a straightforward act of mercy have led to this moment, with unknown riders approaching his home and a terrified girl looking to him as her only hope of survival? "I don't know who you are," he told her quietly, "or what you've done, or what's been done to you. But I gave you my protection when I brought you here, and I don't take such promises lightly." The girl's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion other than fear that he had seen her display. She pressed his large hand between both of hers, and he felt the trembling that ran through her entire body. The hoofbeats were close now, close enough that he could distinguish individual horses. 5 or 6 riders, moving with military precision up the winding path that led to his homestead. Whatever was coming, he would face it as he had faced everything else in his life, with eyes open and shoulders squared, ready to accept the consequences of his choices. Outside, the morning mist was beginning to lift, and the first rays of sunlight painted the fjord in shades of gold and crimson. It would have been a beautiful morning for peace and quiet reflection. Instead, it was about to become the morning when Haldrik the Stoneborn discovered that some rescues come with prices that no honorable man can refuse to pay. The war party crested the hill like storm clouds given flesh and steel. 6 riders, their horses lathered with sweat and steam rising from their flanks in the cool morning air. At their head rode a woman whose presence commanded attention even at a distance. Tall in the saddle, her blonde hair braided with silver wire, and a mail shirt that caught the early sunlight like scales on a serpent's back. Haldrik stepped onto his porch, his massive frame filling the doorway as he watched them approach. Behind him, he could hear Astrid ushering the girl toward the back of the house, though the child's footsteps dragged with reluctance. She wanted to see who was coming, even as every instinct told her to hide. The lead rider dismounted with fluid grace, her boots hitting the ground with barely a sound despite the weight of her war gear. She was perhaps 35 winters old, with the kind of weathered beauty that spoke of years spent under harsh skies and harder battles. Most striking were her eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, missing nothing as they swept over Haldrik's homestead, cataloguing defensive positions and escape routes with the automatic assessment of a seasoned warrior. But it was the silver arm ring she wore that made Haldrik's blood run cold. Twisted bands of precious metal formed the shape of a snarling wolf, its ruby eyes glinting with malevolent life. He had seen that symbol before, carved into shields and painted on the sails of longships that brought death and fire to his enemies. It was the mark of Jarl Ironhand, whose territory lay 2 days' hard ride to the north, and whose hatred for Haldrik's own people ran deeper than the fjords themselves. "Haldrik the Stoneborn," the woman called, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I am Sigrid Ravenclaw, shield maiden to Jarl Ironhand and speaker for his house. I come seeking what was stolen from us 3 nights past." "Nothing has been stolen here," Haldrik replied, keeping his voice level despite the tension that coiled in his chest like a serpent preparing to strike. "This is my land, granted by King Olaf himself, and all who shelter here do so by my invitation." Sigrid's smile was thin as a blade's edge. "Your invitation may have been freely given, but it was accepted under false pretenses. You harbor a runaway, Stoneborn, a child who fled her duties and her family's protection in a moment of foolish rebellion. I harbor a frightened girl who was alone and injured," Haldrik countered. "If she belongs to your Jarl, then let him come himself to claim her. I have no quarrel with men who send women to fight their battles." The insult struck home. He could see it in the way Sigrid's hand moved instinctively toward her sword hilt, and in the murmur of outrage from the other riders. But the shield maiden's discipline held, and when she spoke again, her voice remained steady. Jarl Ironhand sends me because I am his finest tracker and his most trusted counselor. Also because the child knows me, and my presence might spare us all the unpleasantness of a forced extraction. She paused, studying Haldrik's face with those penetrating eyes. You truly don't know who you've been sheltering, do you? I know she's a child in need of protection, Haldrik said. That was enough for me. Her name is Astrid Iron's daughter, Sigrid announced, and the words fell between them like stones into still water, sending ripples of meaning that changed everything. She is the blood daughter of Jarl Ironhand, born of his beloved wife Ingrid, who died bringing her into this world. She is heir to lands that stretch from the Serpent's Fjord to the Iron Mountains, and her disappearance has brought our entire clan to the edge of war. The world seemed to tilt beneath Haldrik's feet. Ironhand's daughter, the child of his people's greatest enemy, the man whose raiders had burned Haldrik's own village when he was barely old enough to hold a sword. The blood feud between their clans stretched back 3 generations, built on grievances and retribution that had claimed dozens of lives on both sides. From inside the house came a sound that pierced him to the bone, a low, keening cry of pure terror. The girl had heard her name spoken aloud, and the sound that emerged from her throat was like that of a trapped animal who sees the hunter's spear raised to strike. She fears you, Haldrik observed, his warrior's instincts taking note of how the other riders shifted nervously at the sound. Why would a daughter fear her father's own warriors? The child has been through an ordeal, Sigrid replied, but something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or guilt. 3 nights ago, she was being escorted to her betrothal ceremony when our party was attacked by bandits. In the confusion, she fled into the wilderness rather than trust in our protection. She has been alone and afraid ever since, and her mind may have conjured fears that have no basis in reality. Betrothal ceremony. The words left Haldrik's mouth like bitter wine. How old is she? 17 winters. Old enough to do her duty to her family and her people. Old enough to have opinions about who she marries, you mean? Sigrid's patience was clearly wearing thin. The alliance was arranged for the good of both clans. The girl's personal preferences are less important than the peace her marriage will secure. And if she disagrees, then she will learn to accept what cannot be changed, as we all must. The shield maiden's voice carried the weight of personal experience, as if she too had once faced choices that were no choices at all. The betrothal has been delayed, but it cannot be postponed indefinitely. Jarl Ironhand has given his word, and the word of a Jarl is not easily broken. Another cry came from inside the house, followed by the sound of something breaking, pottery, perhaps, or a wooden cup hurled against the wall. The girl was listening to every word, understanding that her brief sanctuary was about to end. I want to see her, Haldrik said. I want to hear from her own lips that she wishes to return with you. The child's wishes are not your concern. They are now. Haldrik's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had commanded warriors in battle and led them through the gates of death itself. She came to me for protection, and I will not hand her over to anyone without her consent. You forget yourself. Stoneborn! Sigrid's hand was now fully on her sword hilt, and the other riders had shifted into positions that would allow them to surround the homestead quickly if violence erupted. You have no claim on her, no right to hold her against her family's will. I have the right that comes from being the man who saved her life, Haldrik replied. And I have the right that comes from seeing the terror in her eyes when she looks at you. The standoff stretched between them like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. 6 armed warriors against 1 retired veteran who hadn't touched his sword in years. It should have been no contest at all, yet Sigrid hesitated, and Haldrik understood why. His reputation preceded him, even into retirement. The name Stoneborn carried weight that had nothing to do with his size, and everything to do with the battlefield legends that followed him like smoke from a forge. 3 days, Sigrid finally said, her voice tight with reluctant compromise. I will give you 3 days to convince the girl to come willingly. If she does not, we will take her by force, and any who stand in our way will be considered enemies of Jarl Ironhand. And if I convince her that she's safer staying here, then you will have chosen to make an enemy of the most powerful Jarl north of the mountains. Sigrid's smile was cold as winter moonlight. Think carefully about whether one frightened girl is worth the destruction of everything you've built here. She mounted her horse with the same fluid grace she had shown in dismounting. But before turning away, she called out one final warning. The girl wears something that belongs to her family, a pendant that was her mother's. When you return her, make certain it comes with her. Jarl Ironhand values that trinket almost as much as he values his daughter. The war party wheeled their horses and rode back down the hill, but they didn't go far. Haldrik could see them making camp just beyond the tree line, close enough to watch his homestead, but far enough to avoid appearing like an immediate siege. They would wait and watch, and in 3 days they would return for their answer. Inside the house the crying had stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. Haldrik turned from the porch to find the girl standing in the doorway, her face pale as bone, and her hand clutched around the raven pendant at her throat. The look in her eyes was that of someone who had just heard her own death sentence pronounced. For the first time since pulling her from the flames, she opened her mouth and spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked from disuse and thick with tears. But the words were clear enough. Please don't let them take me, please. The sound of Astrid's voice hung in the air like morning frost, delicate and heartbreaking. For 3 days, Haldrik had wondered what her first words might be. Perhaps a name, or a cry for her family, or even just a simple thank you for the shelter he had provided. He had never imagined they would be a plea so desperate that it seemed to pull the very air from his lungs. He knelt before her, bringing his massive frame down to her eye level, and gently placed his scarred hands on her shoulders. She didn't flinch away as she had those first few hours, a small victory that now seemed precious beyond measure. Tell me why, he said softly. Tell me what you're so afraid of. Astrid's lips trembled as she struggled with words that had been locked inside her for so long. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, each word seeming to cost her tremendous effort. They say it's for peace, she whispered. But peace built on my blood will turn to poison. The man they would give me to... She shuddered, her hand tightening on the pendant. He has cold eyes and cold hands, and he speaks of me like I'm livestock to be bred for better stock. Behind them, old Astrid had quietly appeared with a steaming cup of herbal tea, the kind she brewed for settling troubled stomachs and calming frayed nerves. She set it on the small table beside them and retreated with the wisdom of someone who understood when to offer comfort and when to give space for truth-telling. Your father arranged this marriage. Hildrik asked. My father sees only the alliance it will bring, a union between our houses and the Thornlings of the eastern valleys. Their leader, Bjorn Ironwill, has 40 longships and twice as many warriors. Astrid's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if giving voice to her fears somehow lessened their power over her. Father believes this marriage will secure our borders and end the raiding that has plagued our people for the past 5 winters. But you believe otherwise. I believe Bjorn Ironwill is a man who takes what he wants and destroys what he cannot use. I have seen how he looks at our lands, how he speaks of our people. This marriage is not the beginning of an alliance. It is the first step in our conquest. Haldrik sat back on his heels processing this information. Political marriages were common enough among the great houses, and they often did bring the peace they promised. But he had heard whispers about Bjorn Ironwill, even in his retirement. The man was ambitious beyond measure, and his idea of peace was the kind that came only after all opposition had been crushed beneath his heel. Have you spoken these concerns to your father? I tried. Astrid's laugh was bitter as winter wind. He told me I was being fanciful, that a woman cannot understand the complexities of statecraft. When I persisted, he grew angry and said that my duty was to obey, not to question. The betrothal ceremony was meant to be the end of my objections, but you ran instead. I ran because I overheard Bjorn speaking with his men the night before the ceremony. They thought I was asleep in the women's quarters, but I was hiding in the alcove behind the tapestries. Her eyes grew distant, remembering. He told them that once the marriage was consummated, my father would meet with an unfortunate accident while hunting. A boar attack, perhaps, or a fall from his horse. Then he would rule both territories through me. As my husband and guardian, the words hit Haldrik like a physical blow. This wasn't just about an unwanted marriage. It was about preventing a murder and the destruction of an entire clan. Yet the girl was only 17, with no proof beyond overheard conversations and a young woman's intuition. Did anyone else hear these words? My maid Thyra was with me. But when I tried to tell the others, they said she was merely a thrall girl, whose word meant nothing against that of a jarl. Astrid's voice cracked with frustration. They dismissed us both as hysterical females, seeing plots where none existed, so you fled during the chaos of the bandit attack. There was no bandit attack. The words came out flat and certain, carrying a weight that made Haldrik's blood run cold. Bjorn's men staged it to provide cover for what they thought would be my death. They intended to kill me on the road and tell my father that I had been slain by raiders. Then they would offer him comfort in his grief and suggest that perhaps an alliance was needed more than ever to prevent such tragedies in the future. But you escaped. Thyra saved me. She saw what was happening and created a distraction that allowed me to slip away in the darkness. By the time they realized I was gone, I was already deep in the forest. Astrid's voice broke completely now, tears streaming down her cheeks. I don't know what happened to her. I don't know if she lived or died for helping me. Haldrik felt a familiar fire kindle in his chest, the same cold fury that had driven him through countless battles in his younger days. This was no simple family dispute or reluctant bride's rebellion. This was a plot that reached into the heart of clan politics and threatened the lives of everyone Astrid held dear. The pendant, he said, remembering Sigrid's warning about the family heirloom. Tell me about your mother's pendant. Astrid's hand flew protectively to her throat. It was my mother's and her mother's before that. The raven is our family's guardian spirit, and the pendant has been passed down through 7 generations of women in our line. My father values it because it was the last gift he gave my mother before she died, bringing me into the world. Sigrid seemed very interested in making sure it came back with you, because without it, Bjorn cannot claim legitimacy as the true ruler of our lands. The pendant is not just jewelry, it carries with it the spiritual authority of the female line. Whoever possesses it speaks for the goddess Frigg in matters of marriage and childbirth and the protection of the clan. Astrid's eyes sharpened with understanding. If I die without passing it on, or if it is lost, then any children born to our bloodline will be considered spiritually illegitimate. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. Bjorn didn't just want Astrid for her father's lands. He wanted the pendant that would legitimize his rule in the eyes of the people. Without it, even if he succeeded in murdering Jarl Ironhand, there would always be those who questioned his right to lead. That's why they want you alive, Haldrik said slowly. They need you to willingly give up the pendant as part of the marriage ceremony. And once they have it, I become expendable. A young wife dying in childbirth is a tragedy, but not an uncommon one. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, and Haldrik could see smoke rising from the Watcher's camp beyond the tree line. 2 days remained before Sigrid returned for her answer, and he was beginning to understand that whatever choice he made would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, affecting lives he might never know about. But looking at Astrid, this brave young woman who had risked everything to save her father and her people, he realized that some choices were no choices at all. The evening meal passed in heavy silence. broken only by the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls and the distant sounds of the watchers maintaining their vigil. Haldrik found himself studying Astrid's face in the flickering candlelight, seeing past the fear to the intelligence that burned beneath. This was no helpless child. This was a young woman who had outmaneuvered trained killers and crossed hostile territory, alone to warn of a plot that could destroy her entire clan. After Astrid had retired to the small, sleeping chamber Haldrik had prepared for her, he and old Astrid sat before the fire, sharing a cup of mead and the comfortable silence that comes between old friends who have weathered many storms together. "You mean to keep her?" Astrid said finally. "It wasn't a question. I mean to honor the protection I offered when I pulled her from those flames," Haldrik replied, watching the orange tongues of fire dance in the hearth. "Whether that means keeping her or finding another way to ensure her safety remains to be seen. There is no other way, and you know it." The old woman's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Send her back and she dies. Send her anywhere else, and Iron Hand's reach will find her eventually. The only choice is to make your stand here and hope your reputation carries enough weight to make them think twice." "My reputation," Haldrik laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm one man, Astrid. One aging warrior who hasn't lifted a sword in anger for 5 years. What good is reputation against 6 trained killers? More good than you might think." She leaned forward, fixing him with eyes that had seen as many battles as his own, though hers had been fought in kitchens and sick rooms rather than on blood-soaked fields. "Do you know what they call you in the northern settlements? The stories that mothers tell their children when they want them to behave. Old wives' tales and tavern boasts. They call you the giant who wouldn't fall. They say that in the Battle of Raven's Creek, you stood alone against 20 men and held the bridge until reinforcements arrived. They say that when the serpent ships came to raid the coastal villages, you tracked their leader into his own stronghold and emerged 3 days later carrying his head. Those stories grow taller with each telling. Perhaps, but the fear they inspire is real enough. Why do you think no raiders have troubled these lands since you built your homestead here? Why do you think traveling merchants feel safe enough to take the coastal road instead of the longer mountain passes?" Haldrik considered this. It was true that the region had been remarkably peaceful during his residence here. He had attributed it to luck and the natural protection offered by the fjord's geography. But perhaps his reputation had played a larger role than he realized. "Even if that's true," he said, "it won't protect her forever. Iron Hand has resources I can't match. If I defy him directly, he'll bring an army instead of a war party." "Then don't defy him directly." Old Astrid smiled, with the cunning that had helped her survive 6 decades in a world that was rarely kind to women alone. "You forget, I lived through the years when your father was building his own legacy. I know something about the games that powerful men play. What are you suggesting?" "Challenge the betrothal itself. Not Iron Hand's authority as a father, but his right to bind his daughter to a marriage that violates the old laws." She paused, letting the idea settle in his mind. "A father may arrange a marriage for his daughter, yes. But if that marriage threatens the spiritual well-being of the clan, if it would place the sacred bloodline in the hands of an enemy, then the women of the family have the right to object." "The women of the family," Haldrik repeated slowly. "But Astrid's mother is dead, and she has no sisters or aunts in Iron Hand's household. Ah, but she has something better." Old Astrid's eyes glinted with satisfaction. "She has the pendant, which makes her the spiritual guardian of her bloodline. And according to the old ways, a woman who holds such authority cannot be forced into marriage against her will, not if she can demonstrate that the union would bring spiritual harm to her people." Haldrik felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. A formal challenge to the betrothal? But who would hear such a challenge? Iron Hand's own priests would never rule against him. No, but there are others who might. The Council of Jarls meets twice yearly to settle disputes that cross clan boundaries. If Astrid could present her case before them, backed by credible evidence of Bjorn's intentions. "Evidence we don't have," Haldrik pointed out. Her word against his, and the testimony of a thrall girl who may already be dead. Then we find other evidence. Or we make sure the right people are asking the right questions when the time comes. Old Astrid leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Bjorn Ironwill didn't become powerful by being subtle. Men like him leave trails of enemies and broken promises wherever they go. If his plot against Iron Hand is real, then this won't be his first attempt at such treachery. From the back room came a soft sound, not quite a cry, but the kind of restless movement that suggested Astrid was struggling with dreams that offered no peace. Haldrik had heard similar sounds from his own throat in the years following his worst battles, when sleep brought back memories that daylight could hold at bay. "She trusts you," old Astrid observed quietly. "More than that, she's chosen you as her champion, whether you wanted the role or not. The question is whether you're prepared to accept what that means." What does it mean? It means that if you take her side in this, there's no going back to your peaceful retirement. It means making enemies of powerful people and accepting that your quiet life here is over. It means that everything you've built might be destroyed for the sake of a girl you met 3 days ago. Haldrik stared into the fire, thinking of the choice that seemed to have made itself the moment he pulled Astrid from those flames. Some decisions, he was beginning to understand, weren't really decisions at all. They were simply the moment when a man acknowledged what he had already committed himself to do. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "I want you to take Astrid to the old shrine in the high meadow, the one dedicated to Frigg. If she's going to claim spiritual authority over her own fate, she'll need to do it properly. And what will you be doing?" "I'll be making a journey of my own. If we're going to challenge Bjorn Ironwill's reputation, I need to speak with someone who knew him before he became respectable." Haldrik stood, his joints protesting the movement, but his resolve firm. "I need to find out exactly what kind of man we're dealing with." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming early this year, and with it, the kind of storms that could change the landscape forever. Dawn broke grey and cold over the fjord, with fingers of mist creeping between the pine trees like the ghosts of ancient warriors. Haldrik stood at his window, watching the Watchers' camp stirring to life in the distance. Sigrid's people maintained their vigil with military precision, cooking fires banked at exactly the same time, sentries changing at regular intervals. Horses tended with the care that spoke of long campaigns and hard experience. Professional soldiers, he noted with grudging respect. This wouldn't be settled with bluster or intimidation. Behind him, Astrid moved quietly about the main room, helping old Astrid prepare the morning meal with the kind of automatic efficiency that spoke of noble upbringing. Despite her youth and recent trauma, she had adapted to the simple routines of the homestead with remarkable grace. There was strength in her that went deeper than her bloodline, the kind of resilience that had allowed her to survive 3 nights, alone in hostile territory. The Shrine of Frigg lies 2 hours' walk into the high country. Old Astrid was explaining as she wrapped bread and dried meat in cloth bundles. The path is well marked but steep. You'll need to pace yourself and rest when your body demands it. "I've walked mountain paths before," Astrid replied quietly, though Haldrik noticed she favored her left ankle slightly, an injury from her flight that she had been careful not to mention. "Not like these." "You haven't, and not while carrying the weight of such important purpose." The old woman's voice carried the gentle firmness of someone who had raised children and knew when to push and when to yield. "What you do today will echo through generations. Best to approach it with proper reverence." Haldrik turned from the window, his mind made up. "I'll walk with you as far as the fork in the path. From there, old Astrid will guide you to the shrine, while I take the trader's road toward Thornwick." Thornwick. Astrid looked up from her preparations, concern flickering in her grey-green eyes. "That's close to Bjorn's territory. If his men see you, then they'll see a retired warrior making a trading journey. Nothing more." Haldrik had already planned his story, a simple tale of a man seeking to purchase winter supplies from the craftsmen who worked the iron deposits near Thornwick. Believable enough, and it would give him cover to ask questions about Bjorn Ironwill without arousing suspicion. But if something goes wrong, then old Astrid will guide you to safety through the mountain passes. She knows hidden paths that even the best trackers would struggle to follow. He moved to the wooden chest where he kept his traveling gear, pulling out a leather pack that hadn't seen use in over a year. There are people in the high country who owe me favors. They would shelter you until this matter is resolved. I don't want to run anymore, Astrid said firmly. I've spent 3 days running and it has solved nothing. If I'm to claim spiritual authority over my own fate, then I need to stop acting like a frightened child. The words were spoken with such quiet determination that Haldrik paused in his packing to look at her properly. This was not the terrified girl he had pulled from the flames. This was a young woman who had found her backbone and decided to use it. Courage is a virtue, he said carefully, but so is wisdom. There's no shame in strategic retreat when the odds are overwhelming. The odds have been overwhelming since the moment I overheard Bjorn's plans. But running away won't change them. It will only delay the inevitable. Astrid stood straighter, and for a moment Haldrik could see the future Jarl she might become if she lived long enough. My father needs to know the truth about his chosen ally. My people deserve better than to be sold into slavery disguised as marriage. If I have to risk my life to prevent that, then so be it, old Astrid nodded approvingly. Spoken like a true daughter of the northern clans. Your mother would be proud. You knew my mother? Astrid asked, surprise evident in her voice. I knew of her. Ingrid, the wise speaker, they called her. She had a gift for seeing through men's lies to the truth beneath. The old woman smiled with genuine warmth. They say she could look into a man's eyes and know whether his promises were worth the breath it took to speak them. It seems the gift runs in the bloodline. Outside, a horn sounded from the watcher's camp, not an alarm, but the kind of signal used to coordinate movement. Through the window, Haldrik could see riders mounting their horses and forming up in a patrol formation. They're moving, he observed. Testing the boundaries, old Astrid agreed. Having joined him at the window, seeing how close they can get before you react. It's what I would do if I were trying to gauge an opponent's readiness. The patrol rode slowly along the tree line, making no effort at concealment, but careful to stay just outside what could be considered a direct threat. 6 riders in perfect formation, their weapons clearly visible but not drawn. A message written in horseflesh and steel. We are here. We are watching. We are not going away. 2 more days, Astrid murmured, her hand unconsciously moving to the pendant at her throat. If I'm going to do this properly, I need to understand exactly what rights the old laws give me. The shrine will help with that, old Astrid assured her. Frigg's priestesses carved the sacred laws into the stone walls generations ago. You'll be able to read them for yourself and decide how to proceed. And if the laws don't give me enough authority to challenge the betrothal, then we find another way, Haldrik said firmly. There's always another way for those willing to look hard enough. But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if he truly believed them. Bjorn Ironwill had clearly been planning this takeover for months, perhaps years. Men with that level of patience and cunning rarely left loose ends untied or escape routes unguarded. The patrol completed its circuit and rode back toward the main camp, their message delivered. Tomorrow they would probe a little closer, test a different boundary. The day after that, Sigrid would return for her answer, and all the planning and preparation would come down to a simple choice: surrender Astrid to her fate, or stand against forces that could crush his peaceful world like kindling. Time to go, he announced, shouldering his pack and checking that his long knife was secure at his belt. The road to Thornwick is long, and I want to be well away from here before those patrols decide to expand their range. As they prepared to leave the homestead, Haldrik took one last look around the main room, at the simple furniture he had crafted with his own hands, the tapestries old Astrid had woven during the long winter evenings, the accumulated possessions of 5 years of peaceful living. He wondered if he would ever see any of it again, or if this morning marked the end of one life and the beginning of another entirely. "Whatever happens," he told Astrid as they stepped out into the grey morning, "remember that you chose to fight rather than submit. That choice, whatever its consequences, is yours to make and yours to own." The path ahead disappeared into morning mist, leading toward uncertainties that would test them all in ways they could not yet imagine. The trading post at Thornwick perched on the edge of civilization like a crow on a fence. Post, one foot in the world of honest commerce, the other in the Shadowlands where questions weren't asked and gold spoke louder than law. Haldrik approached it in the late afternoon, his pack arranged to look like that of a genuine trader, his manner carefully adjusted to project the slightly weary competence of a man who had made this journey many times before. The post itself was built into the side of a natural stone formation, its wooden walls reinforced with iron bands, and its windows positioned to provide clear sightlines in all directions. Smart construction for a place that dealt with dangerous people and valuable goods. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and the sound of hammering on metal suggested that the smiths were still at work despite the latening hour. Inside, the main room buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that marked successful trading posts throughout the northern lands. Merchants argued over prices in 3 different languages, while craftsmen displayed their wares, and travelers sought information about road conditions and weather patterns. It was exactly the kind of environment where a man could ask casual questions without drawing unwanted attention. Haldrik made his way to the long wooden bar where a massive man with graying hair and scarred forearms was serving ale from clay jugs. The tavern keeper had the look of someone who had seen everything at least twice and been surprised by very little of it. "Trader's ale," Haldrik said, placing a silver coin on the scarred wood. "And whatever news you might have about the roads north of here." "Roads are passable, but barely," the tavern keeper replied as he filled a wooden cup with dark liquid that smelled of hops and honey. "Early snow in the high passes, and there's been talk of bandits working the merchant routes. Nothing organized, mind you, but enough to make traveling alone a risky proposition." "Bandits!" Haldrik sipped his ale, which was better than he had expected. "Anyone in particular I should watch for?" "No one specific, but the attacks have a pattern. Well-organized, professional. They take what they want and disappear without unnecessary killing." The tavern keeper leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, they feel more like military raids than random brigandage. Like someone with training is putting together crews for specific purposes." This was promising. "Any idea who might be behind it?" "Hard to say for certain, but there's been speculation." The man glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then continued. "Word is that Bjorn Ironwill has been recruiting heavily in recent months. Not just warriors, but scouts and trackers. Men with particular skills for particular jobs. Ironwill. I thought he was focused on legitimate trade these days." The tavern keeper's laugh was bitter. "Bjorn Ironwill's idea of legitimate trade usually involves convincing his competitors that they don't really want to compete anymore. He's been expanding his influence steadily, always through alliances and marriages and perfectly legal arrangements. But the people who oppose those arrangements have a habit of meeting with unfortunate accidents. Hunting mishaps, falls from cliffs, sudden illnesses that the healers can't explain." The man's voice carried the weight of personal knowledge. "My own brother ran a trading route that competed with one of Ironwill's operations. 3 months ago he was found dead beside the road, apparently thrown from his horse. Except my brother was the finest horseman in 3 counties, and the horse was found grazing peacefully a few yards away, completely uninjured." Haldrik felt the familiar cold anger building in his chest. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Aye, well, life in the trading business has always been dangerous. But it used to be dangerous because of weather and wild animals and honest bandits. Now it's dangerous because of men who dress their greed up as political necessity. This expansion of Iron Will's, is it all through intimidation?" "Not entirely. He's clever enough to offer genuine benefits alongside the threats. Protection services for merchant caravans, favorable trade agreements for those who align with his interests. Marriage alliances with prominent families. The tavern keeper paused to serve another customer, then returned to their conversation. The problem is that once you're in his network, getting out becomes almost impossible. Too many people owe him favors, and too many others have seen what happens to those who try to break free. What about the other Jarls? Don't they see what he's doing? Some do. But Ironwill is careful to frame everything in terms of mutual benefit and regional stability. Hard to argue against peace and prosperity, even when you suspect the price might be higher than advertised. The man wiped down the bar with a cloth that had seen better days. Besides, most of the Jarls have their own problems to worry about. Raiding seasons are getting leaner, the fishing grounds are more contested, and everyone's feeling pressure to find new sources of wealth and security. A commotion near the door drew their attention. A group of travelers was entering, their clothes and gear marking them as members of a merchant caravan. But it was their expressions that caught Haldrik's notice, the shell-shocked look of people who had recently experienced violence and barely escaped with their lives. Bandits hit us 2 days. Out from Raven's Ford, the caravan leader was telling anyone who would listen. Took everything of value and burned our wagons. Professional job. Knew exactly what they were looking for and where we'd hidden it. Anyone hurt? Someone called out, 3 of my guards and they took my daughter. The man's voice cracked with grief and rage. Said she'd be returned safely once I delivered a message to Jarl Gormson. Something about reconsidering his position on territorial agreements. Haldrik exchanged glances with the tavern keeper. This was exactly the kind of operation they had been discussing. Targeted, political. Designed to apply pressure rather than simply steal goods. Gormson's been holding out against joining Ironwill's alliance, the tavern keeper murmured. Looks like someone decided to make the choice easier for him. How many other Jarls have received similar messages recently? More than you might think. Ironwill has a gift for finding each man's weakness and applying pressure exactly where it will do the most good, or the most harm, depending on your perspective. As the evening wore on, Haldrik gathered more pieces of the puzzle that was Bjorn Ironwill's rise to power. The man was building a network of control that stretched across multiple territories, using a combination of legitimate alliance building and barely concealed coercion to bring neighboring clans under his influence. The planned marriage to Astrid wasn't just about gaining access to her father's lands. It was about completing a chain of control that would make him the most powerful Jarl north of the mountains. But power built on fear and manipulation was inherently unstable. The trick would be finding the right pressure point to bring the whole structure crashing down. And for that, Haldrik realized, he was going to need allies who understood the stakes as clearly as he was beginning to. The tavern keeper's weathered bronze drinking horn, carved with scenes of ancient battles, caught the firelight as he raised it in a silent toast to fallen friends. It was a gesture that spoke of loyalty, loss, and the kind of determination that came from having nothing left to lose, exactly the kind of sentiment that Haldrik suspected he was going to need in the days ahead. Haldrik returned to his homestead under cover of darkness, his mind heavy with the knowledge he had gathered at Thornwick. The trading post had yielded more information than he had dared hope for, but it had also revealed the true scope of what they were facing. Bjorn Ironwill wasn't just an ambitious Jarl. He was a man systematically dismantling the traditional balance of power throughout the northern territories, and Astrid's forced marriage was merely the final piece in a puzzle that had been years in the making. The homestead appeared quiet as he approached, but something felt wrong. Old Astrid's herb garden, which she tended with religious devotion, showed signs of recent disturbance, footprints in the soft earth, and several plants trampled, as if someone had moved through the space in haste. The door to the main house stood slightly ajar, though he was certain they had barred it before leaving that morning. Drawing his long knife with the silent efficiency of old training, Haldrik approached the entrance with careful steps. No light showed through the windows, and no sound emerged from within. Either the house was empty, or whoever waited inside possessed the discipline of professional killers. He slipped through the doorway like a shadow, his eyes adjusting quickly to the darkness within. The main room appeared undisturbed, but the air carried a scent that didn't belong. Leather oil and steel, the smell of weapons and gear maintained by someone who lived by violence. Someone had indeed been here, and, recently, a soft sound from the back room. Not quite a footstep, but the kind of subtle shift that comes when someone tries very hard to remain motionless. Haldrik moved toward it with the patient stalking technique that had served him well in countless night raids. His knife held low and ready. The door to Astrid's sleeping chamber was closed, but pale light leaked from beneath it. Candlelight, steady and controlled. He pressed his ear to the wood and heard voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Two people, one male and one female, discussing something in words too quiet to make out clearly. With infinite care, he eased the door open just enough to see inside. What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. Astrid sat on the edge of her sleeping pallet, still wearing the simple dress she had donned for the journey to Frigg's shrine. But her hands were bound behind her back with leather cords, and a gag had been tied across her mouth. Standing over her was a man Haldrik didn't recognize, tall and lean, with the kind of watchful stillness that marked him as a professional killer. But it was the woman who truly shocked him. Sigrid Ravenclaw sat in the room's single chair, her blonde hair now hanging loose around her shoulders instead of bound in its usual warrior's braid. She had removed her mail shirt and weapon belt, appearing almost vulnerable in a simple wool dress. Almost, but not quite, because in her hands she held an ornate wooden box, carved with the same raven motifs that decorated Astrid's pendant. "I told you this didn't have to be difficult," Sigrid was saying, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret. "If you had simply come with us 3 days ago, none of this would have been necessary." Astrid made muffled sounds behind her gag, her eyes blazing with fury rather than fear. Whatever had happened since Haldrik left that morning, she had not gone quietly. "The girl has spirit, I'll grant you that," the man said with casual admiration. "Took 3 of us to corner her when she came back from her little pilgrimage. Put up quite a fight before we managed to subdue her. Where is old Astrid?" Sigrid asked, opening the wooden box to reveal a collection of items that made Haldrik's heart sink. Letters bearing official seals, small pieces of jewelry, and what appeared to be lock of dark hair tied with silver thread. "Safe," the man replied, unconscious but unharmed. "She'll wake up with a headache and no memory of how we got past her defenses." Sigrid removed one of the letters from the box and unfolded it carefully. Even from his position by the door, Haldrik could see the broken wax seal and the careful script that marked it as an official document. "This changes everything. You understand?" she told Astrid, holding up the letter so the girl could see it clearly. "Your father's correspondence with King Olaf himself, discussing the terms of your betrothal and the political necessity of your marriage to Bjorn Ironwill. Written in his own hand, sealed with his personal seal, and making it very clear that your personal feelings in the matter are irrelevant to the greater good of the clan." Astrid's eyes widened as she read the contents of the letter, and Haldrik saw something die in her expression, the last vestige of hope that her father might listen to her warnings about Bjorn's true intentions. "But more interesting," Sigrid continued, "is this second letter. The one your father wrote to Bjorn 3 weeks ago, expressing his concerns about certain rumors regarding his future son-in-law's methods of expanding his influence. Apparently, Jarl Ironhand is not quite the trusting fool you believed him to be." She held up another document, and this time, Astrid's reaction was one of confusion rather than despair. "Your father has been conducting his own investigation into Bjorn's activities. He's discovered evidence of the coercion, the staged accidents, even the kidnappings. He knows exactly what kind of man he's allying himself with." Sigrid's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "The difference is that he doesn't care. The marriage will proceed because the alternative, war with Bjorn's coalition, would destroy your clan entirely." The words hit Haldrik like physical blows. Ironhand knew about his future son-in-law's crimes, but was proceeding with the marriage anyway, choosing to sacrifice his daughter's happiness and safety for the survival of his people. It was a calculation that made perfect sense from a political standpoint and was utterly monstrous from a human one. But here's the truly interesting part, Sigrid continued, removing the final item from the box, a piece of parchment that bore a different kind of seal, one that Haldrik recognized with growing horror. 3 days ago, Jarl Ironhand sent a message to his old enemy, Haldrik the Stoneborn. A message offering a substantial reward for the safe return of his daughter, along with assurances that anyone who aided in her capture would be richly compensated and granted safe passage through Ironhand's territory. The world seemed to tilt beneath Haldrik's feet. The message Sigrid held was addressed to him personally, bearing his name and the location of his homestead. It was written in the formal language used for important negotiations, and the seal was genuine. He had seen Ironhand's mark often enough during the years of border conflicts to recognize it immediately. "You see," Sigrid said conversationally, "we didn't come here to take the girl by force. We came here because her father asked us to retrieve her from the man he hired to capture her in the first place. A man whose reputation for tracking fugitives is almost as legendary as his reputation for battlefield prowess." Astrid was staring at him now, her eyes visible over the gag and filled with a betrayal so complete that it seemed to drain all the warmth from the room. She believed it, believed that he had been working for her father all along, that his rescue had been nothing more than an elaborate deception designed to lure her into a false sense of security. "Of course," Sigrid continued, "we both know that's not what really happened. The timing is all wrong, and besides, you're far too honorable to play such games with a child's trust. But Jarl Ironhand doesn't know that. As far as he's concerned, his daughter is exactly where she's supposed to be, in the custody of a man who can be trusted to keep her safe until the wedding arrangements are finalized." The trap was perfect in its simplicity. Whether Haldrik had been working for Ironhand or not, the end result was the same. Astrid was now in the hands of people who would return her to her fate, and any resistance he offered would be seen as a betrayal of an agreement he had never made. But it was the look in Astrid's eyes that cut him most deeply. In the space of a few minutes, he had gone from being her protector to being her betrayer. And no amount of explanation would erase the evidence of that forged correspondence. "Choices, Haldrik the Stoneborn," Sigrid said softly. "Always choices. You can fight us and be branded an oathbreaker who tried to steal a Jarl's daughter for his own purposes. Or you can step aside and allow us to complete what you supposedly started, earning the gratitude of a powerful ally and the gold he promised for your services." Through the window, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the fjord, illuminating a world that had changed irrevocably while he slept. Everything he thought he understood about the situation had been turned on its head, and the simple choice between right and wrong had become something far more complex and dangerous. In her chair, Sigrid smiled the satisfied expression of someone who had just played the winning move in a game that had been planned. Long before her opponent even realized he was playing, the silence that followed Sigrid's revelations stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Haldrik stood frozen in the doorway, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities while his heart hammered against his ribs. The forged correspondence in Sigrid's hands was masterfully done, good enough to fool anyone who hadn't lived through the actual events. But Astrid's eyes told him that explanations would be worthless now. The damage was done. "Step into the room, Haldrik," Sigrid said without turning around. "Slowly, and keep your hands where we can see them. My associate has a crossbow trained on the girl's heart, and his finger tends to twitch when he's nervous." Haldrik emerged from his hiding place, raising his hands in a gesture of apparent surrender while his eyes swept the room for tactical advantages. The lean man held a compact crossbow with the casual competence of someone who had used it to kill before. One bolt, fired from that distance, would punch through Astrid's ribs and into her heart before she could even gasp. No chance for heroic gestures or last-minute rescues. Very good, Sigrid approved. Now let's discuss how this plays out. You have 3 choices, and I want you to understand each one clearly before you decide. I'm listening, Haldrik said, though he was actually calculating distances and angles, looking for any opening that might give him a chance to turn the situation around. First choice, you accept that you've been caught in circumstances beyond your control and allow us to complete our mission. We take the girl back to her father, you collect the gold he promised, and everyone walks away from this alive and relatively wealthy. Simple, clean, and no one has to get hurt. Second choice, you continue this charade of being her protector and force us to kill you both. The girl dies believing you betrayed her. You die knowing you failed to save her, and we report back to Jarl Ironhand that his hired tracker tried to steal his daughter for ransom. Again, simple and clean, but considerably messier. Haldrik waited, knowing there had to be a third option. Sigrid was too intelligent to present only bad choices. She would offer him something that looked reasonable, something that would tempt him to cooperate while still serving her purposes. Third choice, she continued, is the most interesting. You help us get the girl to her wedding, ensuring that she arrives safely and unharmed. In exchange, you receive not just the gold her father promised, but also something far more valuable, information about Bjorn Ironwill's true plans for your own clan's territory. The words hit him like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Did you think this was only about Ironhand's lands? Bjorn's ambitions stretch much further than that. Your own Jarl Eriksson has been marked for the same treatment, an unfortunate hunting accident, followed by expressions of sympathy and offers of protective alliance. The difference is that your people haven't figured out what's happening yet. They still think Bjorn Ironwill is simply an ambitious neighbor rather than a cancer that's spreading through the entire region. Sigrid stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the pre-dawn darkness with the air of someone who had spent many nights contemplating difficult decisions. Help us with this wedding, she said, and I'll give you detailed information about Bjorn's timeline for moving against your clan. Names, dates, methods, everything you need to warn your people and prepare them for what's coming. Refuse, and you'll die here tonight, leaving your people defenseless against an enemy they don't even know they have. It was expertly done, an appeal to his sense of duty that transcended personal loyalty. Save one girl and doom his entire clan, or sacrifice her to save hundreds of people who trusted him to protect them. The kind of choice that had no right answers, only different degrees of wrong. But there was something else in Sigrid's voice, something that didn't quite ring true. She was offering him information about Bjorn's plans with the confidence of someone who had access to the man's inner circle. That suggested either that she was working directly for Bjorn, which seemed unlikely given her obvious loyalty to Ironhand, or that she had sources within his organization that she was willing to expose. You're not just Ironhand's shield maiden, he said slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. You're working against Bjorn, too. Sigrid's reflection in the window showed the ghost of a smile. Astute. Yes, I serve Jarl Ironhand faithfully, but I also serve the greater good of our people. Bjorn Ironwill represents a threat that goes beyond clan politics. He's trying to reshape the entire balance of power in the north. And if he succeeds, everyone becomes his vassal or his victim. Then why go through with the marriage? Why hand Astrid over to a man you know is dangerous? Because sometimes you have to sacrifice the few to save the many. She turned back to face him, and her pale eyes held depths of regret that spoke of other difficult choices made in darker times. Ironhand's alliance with Bjorn buys us time. Time to gather evidence, time to build counter-alliances, time to find a way to bring him down from within his own network. And Astrid will have to endure a marriage she doesn't want while serving as our eyes and ears in Bjorn's household. Not a pleasant fate, but better than watching her entire clan be destroyed because her father refused a necessary alliance. The pragmatism was flawless, and it made Haldrik sick to his stomach. He had seen this kind of thinking before, during the worst of the border wars, the cold calculation that reduced human lives to pieces on a game board, to be moved and sacrificed according to strategic necessity. Behind her gag, Astrid made a sound that was half sob, half growl of rage. She understood what was being discussed, understood that even the people who claimed to care about her welfare were treating her as nothing more than a tool to be used in their larger games. "There's another way," Haldrik said quietly. "Is there?" Sigrid raised an eyebrow. "Please, enlighten me. You say you're gathering evidence against Bjorn. What if you had a witness to his crimes? Someone who overheard him planning murder and conquest in his own words? The girl's testimony? Even if anyone believed her, she's hardly an impartial witness. A reluctant bride claiming her betrothed is plotting against her father would be dismissed as hysteria. Not her testimony, mine." The room went very still. Even the lean man with the crossbow shifted slightly, his attention caught by the unexpected direction of the conversation. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sigrid asked. "You want Astrid delivered to her wedding?" "I want evidence that will bring down Bjorn Ironwill before he can destroy more families. We both get what we want, but we do it my way." "Which is?" Haldrik took a careful step forward, his mind racing through the possibilities. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was the only path he could see that didn't require him to choose between saving Astrid and saving his clan. "I escort her to the wedding as planned. But instead of simply handing her over and walking away, I stay for the ceremony. I watch, I listen, and I wait for Bjorn to reveal himself the way men like him always do when they think they've won. He's not stupid enough to confess his crimes in front of witnesses. No. But he might be arrogant enough to let something slip to the man he thinks captured his bride for him. Especially if that man asks the right questions and knows what to listen for." Sigrid considered this, her tactical mind clearly working through the implications. "And if he doesn't reveal anything useful? Then Astrid gets married as planned, and I disappear into the wilderness with whatever gold you're offering. But if he does slip up, if he gives me the evidence you need, then we bring him down together," Sigrid finished. "Interesting. Risky beyond measure, but interesting. It's the only way that doesn't require us to sacrifice innocent people for political expediency. There are no innocent people in politics, Haldrik. There are only people who haven't been forced to make impossible choices yet." But despite her words, he could see that she was seriously considering his proposal. The lean man spoke for the first time since Haldrik had entered the room. "This is madness. Too many variables, too many ways for it to go wrong. Better to stick with the simple plan." "Simple plans often work," Sigrid agreed. "But this situation has moved beyond simple. Bjorn Ironwill is expecting to receive a broken, compliant bride who will serve his purposes without question. Instead, he'll be getting a young woman who knows exactly what he's planning, accompanied by a legendary warrior who has every reason to want him dead. That's supposed to be an advantage. It creates opportunities, pressure that might force him into mistakes he wouldn't otherwise make." Sigrid moved back to her chair, settling into it with the deliberate grace of someone making a momentous decision. "Very well, Haldrik the Stoneborn. We'll try it your way. But understand the stakes. If this goes wrong, if Bjorn suspects what we're really doing, all of us will die. And our deaths will leave both our clans defenseless against a man who has already proven he's willing to use any method necessary to achieve his goals." Outside, the first rays of sunlight were painting the fjord in shades of gold and crimson. It would have been a beautiful morning for new beginnings. But instead, it felt like the dawn of a day that would test them all in ways they could barely imagine. The game they were about to play had stakes measured in the lives of entire clans, and the price of failure would be paid in blood and ashes for generations to come. The wedding feast at Bjorn Ironwill's stronghold was a display of wealth and power designed to intimidate as much as celebrate. The great hall stretched nearly 100 feet from end to end, its massive oak beams carved with scenes of conquest and domination. Tapestries depicting ancient victories hung from the walls. while torches in iron sconces cast dancing shadows that made the carved figures seem to writhe and struggle in eternal combat. Haldrik stood near the high table, his formal traveling clothes making him appear every inch the successful mercenary who had delivered valuable goods for appropriate compensation. The role felt like wearing another man's skin, but he maintained the facade with the discipline of someone who had learned that survival often depended on becoming what others expected to see. Astrid sat at Bjorn's right hand, resplendent in a wedding dress of white silk embroidered with silver thread. Her dark hair had been braided with pearls and ribbons, and the raven pendant, her mother's pendant, gleamed at her throat like a chain binding her to her fate. She had not spoken a word to Haldrik since their arrival that morning, and when their eyes met across the crowded hall, hers held nothing but cold contempt. The ceremony itself had been a masterpiece of political theatre. Bjorn had played the role of devoted bridegroom to perfection, speaking his vows with apparent sincerity, while Astrid responded with the mechanical precision of someone who had rehearsed the words without meaning them. When the priest called for the exchange of rings, she had extended her hand with the resigned grace of a martyr approaching the block. But it was Bjorn himself who commanded Haldrik's attention. The man was impressive in the way that apex predators were impressive. Everything about him spoke of controlled violence and patient hunger. Tall and broad-shouldered, with iron-grey hair and pale blue eyes that missed nothing, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never encountered an obstacle he couldn't crush or manipulate. "Haldrik the Stoneborn," Bjorn called out, raising his drinking horn in salute. "The man who made this celebration possible. Come, join me at the high table. I would hear the tale of how you tracked down my wayward bride." This was the moment Haldrik had been preparing for, the chance to get close enough to Bjorn to learn something useful while playing the role of hired tracker. He made his way through the crowd with careful steps, nodding acknowledgement to the various jarls and their retinues who filled the hall. "An impressive feat," Bjorn continued as Haldrik approached. "The girl had been missing for 3 days, with some of my best trackers unable to find so much as a footprint. Yet you located her within hours of beginning your search. Experience teaches you where frightened prey tends to run," Haldrik replied, settling into the chair that had been prepared for him. "Most people, when they flee in panic, make the same mistakes. They follow paths instead of breaking new ground. They seek shelter in obvious places, and they underestimate how far their pursuers are willing to go to find them." Wise words, and profitable ones, I imagine. Jarl Ironhand spoke highly of your efficiency. The casual mention of Ironhand sent a chill down Haldrik's spine. If Bjorn was confident enough to reference the arrangement openly, it suggested that he believed everything was proceeding according to plan. The Jarl was generous in his compensation, Haldrik agreed, though I admit I was surprised by the urgency of his request. Most fathers would search for a missing daughter themselves rather than hiring outside help. But Ironhand is a clever man. He understood that a professional tracker would be far more effective than a party of emotional relatives blundering through the countryside. Bjorn's smile was sharp as a blade. Besides, he had other concerns to occupy his attention. Border negotiations, trade agreements, the usual responsibilities of leadership. Still, it must have been difficult for him to trust his daughter's safety to a stranger. Trust. Bjorn laughed, a sound like winter wind through bare branches. "My dear Haldrik, trust is a luxury that men in our position cannot afford. Ironhand hired you not because he trusted you, but because he knew exactly what you would do when faced with a choice between gold and sentiment." The words were delivered with casual cruelty, but Haldrik sensed an opportunity. And what choice was that? The choice between protecting one frightened girl and securing your own future prosperity. Between childish idealism and adult pragmatism. Bjorn leaned closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Ironhand told me about your retirement, your peaceful homestead, your desire for a quiet life. He gambled that when push came to shove, you would choose practical benefits over romantic gestures." He was right. Of course he was. Men like us understand the world as it truly is, not as we might wish it to be. We know that sometimes the strong must make difficult decisions on behalf of the weak, and that the greater good occasionally requires individual sacrifice. Beside them, Astrid sat in silence, but Haldrik could see her hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. She was listening to every word, and what she heard was confirmation of everything she believed about his betrayal. Speaking of the greater good, Bjorn continued, I hope you'll consider remaining in my service after tonight. A man with your skills could find considerable opportunity in my household, especially as I expand my influence throughout the region. Expansion? Oh yes, this marriage is merely the first step in a much larger plan. Within a year, I expect to control territory stretching from the Serpent's Fjord to the Iron Mountains. The old system of dozens of competing Jarls is inefficient. What the North needs is unified. Leadership under someone with the vision and strength to impose lasting order. Here was the opening Haldrik had been waiting for. That's an ambitious undertaking. Some of the other Jarls might resist such unification. Resistance is temporary. Most reasonable men come to understand the benefits of cooperation when the alternatives are made clear to them. Bjorn's eyes glittered with satisfaction. Take Jarl Eriksson, for example. His lands border yours, I believe? The mention of Jarl Eriksson's name hit Haldrik like a physical blow, but years of battlefield discipline kept his expression neutral. Eriksson was more than just his clan leader. He was the closest thing to a father Haldrik had ever known, the man who had taken in an orphaned boy and taught him the skills that had made him a legend. Eriksson is an old-fashioned ruler, Haldrik said carefully, set in his ways, resistant to change. Exactly the problem, Bjorn agreed, reaching for a silver goblet that bore the twisted wolf design of his house. Men like him cling to outdated notions of independence and personal honor when what the region truly needs is coordinated strategy and unified purpose. Unfortunately, such men rarely see reason until circumstances force their hand. What sort of circumstances? Bjorn's smile was that of a cat contemplating a particularly plump mouse. Oh, the usual difficulties that befall aging jarls. Hunting accidents, falls from horses, sudden illnesses that strike in the night. The North is a dangerous place after all, full of natural hazards and unpredictable mishaps. The casual way he spoke of murder made Haldrik's blood run cold, but he forced himself to nod with apparent understanding. And after such mishaps occur, well, naturally, neighboring jarls would offer assistance to the grieving families. Protection services, trade agreements, perhaps even marriage alliances to provide stability during the transition of power. Bjorn took a long drink from his goblet, savoring both the wine and his own cleverness. It's remarkable how quickly people come to appreciate strong leadership when their alternatives have been removed. You've given this considerable thought. Years of thought. The old ways are dying, Haldrik. The age of dozens of petty chiefs squabbling over scraps of territory is ending, whether they realize it or not. The future belongs to men with vision enough to see beyond their own borders and strength enough to impose their will across entire regions. Across the hall, Haldrik caught sight of Sigrid standing near the great hearth, her warrior's eyes scanning the crowd with professional alertness. She wore the formal dress of a high-ranking retainer, but he could see the subtle bulge of a concealed knife beneath her sleeve. When their gazes met, she gave him the slightest nod. She was listening, ready to act when the moment came. This vision of yours, Haldrik continued, it would require considerable resources. Men, ships, weapons, all of which I have in abundance, thanks to the wisdom of strategic alliances. Bjorn gestured around the hall, where representatives from dozens of clans mingled and feasted. Every marriage, every trade agreement, every treaty of mutual protection adds to my strength. Soon I'll command the largest coalition north of the mountains, and those who refuse to join face the consequences of their short-sightedness. Bjorn's expression hardened, revealing the predator beneath the civilized facade. I offered Eriksson the chance to ally himself with my coalition 6 months ago. He responded with some nonsense about maintaining his clan's independence and honoring the old agreements with his neighbors. Pride, in other words. Foolish, stubborn pride. Haldrik felt the familiar cold fury building in his chest, the same rage that had driven him through countless battles in defense of his people. So you'll move against him. I've already moved against him. 3 of his most trusted advisors have suffered unfortunate accidents in recent weeks. His best tracker disappeared while pursuing bandits who may or may not have existed. His eldest son's ship was found drifting empty after a routine trading voyage. Bjorn's voice carried the satisfaction of a man recounting personal victories. Each loss weakens his position and demonstrates the futility of standing alone against superior force. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The accidents, the disappearances, the gradual erosion of Ericsson's power base, all of it orchestrated by the man sitting beside him. Speaking of murder as casually as he might discuss the weather, Ericsson himself will meet his fate within the month. A boar hunt, I think. He's famous for his courage in pursuing dangerous game. Such a pity when brave men take unnecessary risks. Bjorn raised his goblet again. After that, his remaining children will be only too grateful for the protection and guidance I can provide. The transition will be remarkably smooth. At that moment, Astrid turned to look directly at Haldrik, and what he saw in her eyes made his heart clench. Not contempt now, but understanding. She had been listening to every word, and she finally comprehended the true scope of what they were facing. The look she gave him was a mixture of apology and desperate hope, as if she were silently begging him to find a way to stop the monster she had been forced to marry. "You know," Bjorn said conversationally, "I'm curious about something. When you found my wayward bride, was she alone?" The question came so casually that it took Haldrik a moment to recognize the trap. "Alone?" I ask, because she mentioned having a companion during her flight. A servant girl named Thyra, who supposedly helped her escape. We never found any trace of this girl, which strikes me as odd. Either she never existed, or someone took considerable care to ensure she couldn't be found. Haldrik's mind raced. This was the test. The moment when his story would either hold up under scrutiny or crumble completely. The girl was alone when I found her. Frightened, hungry, but definitely alone. Interesting. Then either young Astrid was mistaken about her companion, or this mysterious Thyra met with some misfortune during the journey. Bjorn's pale eyes fixed on Haldrik with uncomfortable intensity. I suppose we'll never know which. But there was something in his tone that suggested he knew exactly what had happened to Thyra, and that the knowledge gave him considerable satisfaction. Another piece of evidence that this man was capable of any cruelty if it served his purposes. The great hall suddenly felt too small, too warm, too full of predators wearing human faces. Around them, the wedding feast continued in blissful ignorance of the darkness that sat at the high table, planning the destruction of entire bloodlines with the calm efficiency of a merchant tallying profits. The moment came sooner than Haldrik expected, triggered not by careful planning, but by Bjorn's own arrogance. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, the new bridegroom grew expansive in his boasting, speaking more openly about his methods and ambitions with each passing hour. "The beauty of it," Bjorn was saying, gesturing with his goblet toward the assembled wedding guests, "is that each success makes the next one easier. When word spreads that Jarl Ericsson has met with an unfortunate hunting accident, his remaining allies will see the pattern. They'll understand that resistance is futile and accommodation is survival, and if they don't?" Haldrik asked, though he already knew the answer. Then they join their stubborn colleague in whatever afterlife awaits failed leaders. Bjorn's laugh carried across the hall, drawing nods and smiles from guests who assumed they were witnessing harmless wedding night banter. "I have operatives in place throughout the region, men who owe me favors, men who fear me, men who simply understand which way the winds of change are blowing. When I give the word, Ericsson and his inner circle will simply disappear." It was exactly the confession Sigrid had hoped for, delivered in front of witnesses who could testify to what they had heard. But even as Haldrik felt a surge of satisfaction at finally having the evidence they needed, he realized that Bjorn had made a critical error in his planning. He had underestimated Astrid. The young woman had endured the ceremony and the feast with stoic dignity, playing her role as the compliant bride, while her new husband revealed himself to be everything she had feared and worse. But as Bjorn spoke casually of murdering her father's allies and destroying entire bloodlines, something changed in her posture. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and her hand moved almost unconsciously to the raven pendant at her throat. When she stood from her chair, the movement was so sudden and unexpected that conversation around the high table faltered. Every eye in the immediate vicinity turned to her, including those of her new husband. "My lords and ladies," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet portion of the hall, "I would share with you the ancient blessing of the bride's bloodline." It was brilliant, a perfectly legitimate request that no one could refuse without appearing to disrespect both tradition and the new bride herself. Bjorn's expression flickered with annoyance, but he gestured for her to proceed. Astrid removed the raven pendant from around her neck, holding it high so that the firelight caught the silver inlay and made the garnet eyes seem to blaze within a fire. For a moment she stood silent, and Haldrik realized she was gathering her courage for what was either an act of tremendous bravery or elaborate suicide. "This pendant has been blessed by 7 generations of the women of my line," she announced, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It carries with it the wisdom of those who came before, and through it they speak to us still." She closed her eyes, clasping the pendant to her breast in a gesture that appeared deeply spiritual. When she opened them again, her gaze fixed on Bjorn with an intensity that made several guests step back unconsciously. "They tell me," she continued, "that this marriage is not blessed by the old gods, that it was born in deception and will bear fruit only in blood and betrayal. They warn that the man I have wed this night plans treachery against my father and death for those who have shown us kindness." The hall erupted in murmurs of confusion and concern. This was not the gentle blessing anyone had expected, and the implications of what Astrid was saying began to sink in among the more politically astute guests. Bjorn's face had gone pale, then red with fury. "The girl is overwrought," he said loudly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Wedding nerves have affected her judgment. Perhaps she should retire." "The spirits do not lie," Astrid interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade through silk. "They show me visions of good men dying in staged accidents, of clans destroyed by treachery disguised as alliance, of a wolf in man's form who devours everything he touches." She turned to face the assembled guests, many of whom were representatives of the very clans Bjorn intended to target. "They warn that tonight's celebration marks not the beginning of peace, but the first feast in a hall built on graves." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Several jarls were already reaching for their weapons, their faces grim with understanding. They had come here expecting political theatre and had instead walked into a trap, or perhaps a revelation that would save their lives. Bjorn lunged for Astrid with a snarl of rage, but Haldrik was faster. Years of combat instincts took over as he surged from his chair, catching Bjorn's wrist before the man's hand could reach his bride. The impact sent both men crashing to the floor, but Haldrik had the advantage of surprise and superior positioning. "Seize them!" Bjorn shouted as he struggled beneath Haldrik's weight. "They're conspiring against me." But his call was met not with obedience, but with the sound of steel being drawn throughout the hall. The jarls who had come as wedding guests were now looking at their host with new eyes, seeing not a potential ally, but a confirmed threat to their own survival. Sigrid appeared at Astrid's side, her own blade gleaming in the torchlight as she helped the young woman back to safety. "Well done," she murmured. "Your mother would be proud." The confrontation that followed was brief and brutal. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Bjorn's household guards found themselves facing a coalition of clan warriors who had just learned that their host had been planning their deaths. The man who had thought himself the master of political manipulation discovered that his web of lies could not survive the bright light of public exposure. In the end, it was not Haldrik's sword or Sigrid's strategy that brought down Bjorn Ironwill. It was the courage of a 17-year-old girl who chose to speak truth to power when silence would have been safer. 3 months later, as winter settled over the fjords like a blanket of peace, Haldrik stood once again on his porch, watching the morning mist rise from waters that no longer carried the threat of war. Astrid sat beside him, free at last to choose her own path, the raven pendant gleaming at her throat as a symbol not of bondage, but of the strength that had saved them all. Sometimes, he reflected, the most dangerous thing a man can do is follow his heart. But sometimes it's also the only thing worth doing.